have the pleasure to invite to the rostrum His Excellency Antony Blinken, Deputy Secretary of State of the United States of America.
Mr. President of the Council, distinguished delegates, it is an honor to represent the United States here at the Human Rights Council on its 10th anniversary. The commitment of the United States to the mandate and mission of this Council runs deep in our nation's history, where it's engraved in our founding values and etched into standards that we strive to hold ourselves to every single day. 6 years ago, the United States engaged with this Council under the leadership of President Obama. He made that decision not only because we share the aspirations of this Council, but because the world does. The fight for greater freedom, for greater respect, greater dignity, is a unifying narrative of our humanity in all its diversity. And we are proud to join this Council in upholding our common responsibility to this universal pursuit. That's why I'm very pleased today to reaffirm the United States' intention to seek re-election to the Council. We need the principled, balanced, proactive leadership of this Council now more than ever before, in a world where a growing number of countries are laying siege to civil society. It's a world where violent extremism thrives in the shadows of marginalization and transforms some of those who feel cast aside, left behind, or repressed into slavers and executioners. It's a world where unprecedented refugee and migrant flows are making more people, especially women and children, vulnerable to predation, to trafficking, and to abuse. In Russia, a little more than a year after former Deputy Prime Minister Boris Nemtsov's murder in central Moscow, the Russian government's attempts to suffocate civil society, suppress political opposition, and stigmatize members of minority groups continue unabated. As we approach the 2-year anniversary of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, we remain gravely concerned about the deteriorating human rights situation in Ukraine's Donbass and in the occupied peninsula. Raids, arrests, baseless prosecutions, and torture have become regular facts of life for civilians, especially for those in the Tatar community. Occupation authorities and Russian-backed separatists have moved systematically to suppress dissent and impose a new repressive way of life in these parts of Ukraine. Russian-supported separatists in the Donbass prevent Ukrainian residents from accessing humanitarian assistance, leaving civilians without sufficient food and shelter. This is simply unacceptable. We welcome the Council's continued attention to these egregious abuses and call on Russia to do its part by putting an end to this behavior. In Egypt, we are deeply concerned by mounting allegations of abuses by security services, particularly arbitrary arrests. It's important for President Sisi to uphold his pledge to address these allegations and restore public trust. We strongly support Egypt's efforts to confront the threats of terrorism and surmount its economic challenges. But long-term peace and stability require trust, accountability, and avenues for peaceful dissent. Conditions continue to deteriorate horrifically in South Sudan, where the UN is documenting large-scale extrajudicial killings, sexual violence, abductions, and enforced disappearances. We hear of indiscriminate attacks against civilians, the forced recruitment of children, and extensive destruction of property. The widespread scale of atrocities is such that this Council must take further action immediately. In Venezuela, the people have made their desire for change known in a peaceful and democratic way. Meaningful dialogue among all parties and respect for the newly elected legislature are essential. Opposition leaders such as Leopoldo Lopez and Antonio Ledesma should be released, and the prolonged and arbitrary detention of critical voices must end. In Cuba, we are increasingly concerned about the government's use of short-term detentions of peaceful activists, which reached record numbers this past January. We call on the Cuban government to stop this tactic as a means of quelling peaceful protest. President Obama will make a historic visit to Cuba in just a few weeks, and he will emphasize that the Cuban people are best served by an environment where people are free to choose their political parties and their leaders, to express their ideas, and where civil society is independent and allowed to flourish. In China, we are alarmed by the ongoing crackdown on lawyers, religious adherents, civil society leaders, and by growing attempts to restrict internationally recognized freedoms, including the freedom of speech. We're deeply troubled by China's willingness to threaten journalists with expulsion or with the non-renewal of their visas as a tool to influence their reporting. Hundreds of Chinese citizens have been detained, formally arrested, or held incommunicado without due process. This includes the apparent abduction of 5 individuals associated with a Hong Kong bookstore that strongly suggests that China has taken extrajudicial or extraterritorial action in violation of its international commitments. In all of these cases, and in too many more, this Council has an obligation and a mandate to shine a bright light on grievous violations of human rights and to hold the perpetrators accountable. When it does, we have seen the difference it can make. We've seen the impact of the Council's leadership through the emergency special session on Burundi and Iraq, the creation of special rapporteurs on Iran and Belarus, mandates for the Office of High Commissioner, and UN panels to examine human rights in South Sudan and Burundi. We've seen the value of the Council's new tools, like the Universal Periodic Review process and technical support for countries like Colombia, Mali, the Central African Republic. We've seen the importance of establishing commissions of inquiry into gross human rights violations in Syria, in North Korea, in Eritrea, to help lay the groundwork for the day when justice will come, because it will, and the importance of the UN Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture for those rebuilding their lives. And we've seen the hope and promise of nations like Burma and Sri Lanka taking stock of the aspirations of their citizens and setting out on a new journey to meet those aspirations. While we celebrate and support their progress, we believe it's vital for this Council to remain engaged as the governments confront the legacies of human rights violations and address the challenges that remain. In Burma recently, I shared our strong concern about discrimination and violence experienced by ethnic and religious minorities, including the Rohingya population, and our deep belief in the importance of the rule of law equally applied to all citizens. The Council must act on issues of anti-discrimination and inclusion at a time when people continue to be targets of violence simply because of who they are, because of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their political beliefs, or their religion. We believe the Council must do better to protect the human rights of these marginalized individuals. The United States is greatly encouraged by the work that is taking place in this Council, but that work is undermined by a persistent bias against Israel. No other nation has a standalone item on this Council's agenda. So long as the Council persists in its efforts to delegitimize and isolate Israel, it will be profoundly limited in the good that it can accomplish. Under President Obama, we've worked tirelessly to protect Israel's legitimacy on the world stage and to fight for its full and equal participation in United Nations institutions. We will continue to do so. All of us deserve balanced scrutiny. All of us can do better, including my own country, the United States. The work of democracy is painstakingly hard, and it is never ending. In my own nation's history, it's been marked by times of struggle and times of setback, when the results of our efforts don't meet our own expectations and our actions fall short of our ideals. But the measure of our success, the measure of our courage as leaders, the measure of our strength as nations, is how we face these challenges. Whether we retreat into destabilizing tactics of repression and sectarianism, or whether we confront our own imperfections with honesty, with openness, with transparency. The consequences of this choice are playing out across the world today. The results could not be clearer. Advancing human rights, advancing fundamental freedoms, this is not a cause for vulnerability and insecurity. It is, to the contrary, the single greatest reservoir of strength and stability. Thank you very, very much.